Ukrainian forces have reportedly liberated another 16 square kilometers outside Pokrovsk. Just what is this new Ukrainian strategy involving pushing Russia back? And is this part of a larger offensive or just a spoiling attack by the Ukrainians? Plus, we're going to talk about President Trump appointing one of the most critical top U.S. attorneys who happens to be a RT and Sputnik news commentator. Just how do you go from being on the Russian payroll to being one of the top dogs in criminal prosecution? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so this is a interesting kind of turn of events, right? The General Syrskyi, commander of Ukrainian armed forces, has said that the Ukrainians have taken back about 16 square kilometers near Pokrovsk in Donetsk Oblast in the last couple of weeks. But the Russian offensive operations have captured 133 square kilometers in March. But what's notable is that this is actually one of the lowest daily totals in the last year. So a sign that the Russian offensive capabilities are diminishing considerably. And I think this is sort of a reflection of a changing warfare environment, right? We saw sort of things evolve from the widespread use of drones as augments, now as one of the primary offensive weapons. But now we're seeing drones that can even beat electronic warfare. So it's almost as though the iteration cycle of war is seeming to pick up. You had the emergence of drones favoring the offense in some ways. Then you had the emergence of electronic warfare favoring, in some ways, defensive efforts. And then you have, again, these fiber optic drones that are very effective offensive tools. Now, let's take a look at where this offensive took place, or offensive action. Let's characterize things properly. So one, I want to point out that you're seeing a majority of gains still going to the Russians, and that these are very localized offensives by Ukraine. You can see here they're seizing, again, this small windbreak set to the east of the town of Shevchenko. And while not intrinsically itself exceptionally valuable, the Ukrainian armed forces are committed to holding Pokrovsk, and you can see that a big part of that strategy is maintaining a certain level of standoff distance. When you look, you can see that by moving the front lines, at least the last Russian positions here, to be about 6 kilometers from the front line, it provides at least a reasonable amount of standoff distance, though the range of an FPV drone is typically about 10 kilometers. So you can see that FPV drones can operate basically throughout Pokrovsk, but I think more critically, there's a Russian effort to encircle the town. And you can see that the real important part of Pokrovsk is not actually in Pokrovsk proper. Instead, it is here to the northeast, where a key supply route runs both east-west and, to a lesser extent, north-south. But this east-west route allows Ukrainians to bring in supplies from relatively secure locations like Pavlohrad, and bring them into Pokrovsk, where they can then be safely offloaded and then distributed across the front line. You can see literally this road stretching all the way across this entire middle eastern part south of Chasiv Yar. And this is not an accident, right? This is a reflection of the fact that the Russians know that cutting off this road would be extremely valuable for them, and the Ukrainians know that too. And so they are attempting to sort of tourniquet and then cut the Russian offensive arm, literally the Russian troops here in Kotlina, trying to extend their flanking maneuver around Pokrovsk, and the Ukrainians want to pressure them on actually both sides, where, again, you can see here, while, again, assuming the range of a good drone is about 10 kilometers, you can see that as long as this region remains 9 kilometers deep, they can just barely, again, they generally want to have their actual drone pilots about 15 kilometers from the border, but there are some rumors that using a mesh network, relays, even like kind of mothership type drones, that you can extend drone strikes 30 to 40 kilometers. But the idea is that you're going to cut off this area, and in turn, the Ukrainians are going to prevent these forces from receiving the sort of logistics that they need. In fact, it's basically the same tactic that the Russians used to drive the Ukrainians out of Kursk, right? Targeting the key roadway here leading to Sudza, this key supply route. By cutting this off, again, with the frequent use of fiber optic drones, the Ukrainian forces in the fight were unable to get resupplied and were forced to continually retreat. And so this looks like a kind of almost new iteration, a new type of offensive tactic involving, again, cut and amputate effectively. And now, just because we're seeing more Russian gains, slow though they are, we're seeing Ukrainian defensive tactics continually improve, right? Ukraine has recently taken out one of the largest single Russian offensive operations in several months, taking out 140 troops and 29 vehicles in a Zaporizhzhia assault, right, from the south. Now, this is interesting because as we've seen, Russian troops have focused on the smaller scale assault operations, right? Small groups of 3 to 4 sort of trickling out into different directions, but pushing broadly against Ukrainian forces and only engaging Ukrainian positions as a means to identify them. And then the work of drones and artillery sort of finish the fight. In Zaporizhzhia, right? And so the fact that Russians are pivoting away from this and back towards mechanized assaults reflects, I think, a sense that the Russians may have that the Ukrainians may be more diminished in their military capabilities than they really are. What's worth noting, for example, is that one of the reasons why this 3 to 4 man assault team that's highly dispersed became the norm is because of cluster munitions, right? Before the Ukrainians were able to deploy cluster munitions, formations could operate in groups of 30 to 100, right? But because cluster munitions are brilliant at taking out these kind of areas, right? 500-600 meter diameter circles, it really, that is just the perfect size to mow down a company-sized assault. And so in turn, it became fire team-sized assaults. But this, the fact that the U.S. is really, let's be honest, terminating aid to Ukraine, sort of slow walking it, means that the Russians are going to continually launch these kind of assaults just to see if the Ukrainians still have cluster munitions, to see if they still have the firepower to thwart these assaults. Because one of the things that we know, for example, is that oftentimes in these kind of asymmetric wars like World War I, there's a stalemate until one day suddenly there isn't. And the Russians are going to continually be probing the Ukrainian armed forces to try to find the day when their lines become brittle and unable to resist these kind of assaults. And so obviously right now, that is definitely not the case, as the group of 40 armored vehicles and a dozen buggies were basically taken out and turned around. In fact, Ukrainian aerial reconnaissance spotted the Russians 8 kilometers from the contact line. And over the next 2.5 hours, the Russians lost 29 different pieces of military equipment, 3 tanks, likely a bunch of their buggies and APCs, and 140 personnel, and no one had to withdraw. So I think this is an emblematic of the fact that the Russians believe the Ukrainians are far weaker than they really are, and the fact that they believe they can continue to at least put up this armor to these kind of assaults, at least in testing capabilities. Now, we're going to talk about a NATO ally sending some of its own troops to Ukraine, and of course, a Sputnik payroll U.S. attorney who is now one of the top attorneys in the United States. But first, I want to mention that if you guys are fans of this channel, you know I am pretty critical of the administration and pretty willing to, frankly, be critical of everybody. And that's that's a tough spot to be in, right? A lot of sponsors don't want to touch my content, but that's okay. I don't worry about it because I have you guys backing me up over on combatvetnews.com, right? This is any one of these tiers is going to get you access to an archive of hundreds of uncensored combat videos, the kind that YouTube doesn't let me show you. And of course, every Tuesday and Thursday, I drop another video doing analysis of the fighting from the front line. On Tuesday, we took a look at some footage sent to me by one of the guys on the front lines in position as his position is literally hit with a Russian 500 kilogram fab bomb. So a crazy, crazy video that we got to take a look at. So really interesting stuff. And I really would say it's worth checking out. It's worth becoming a member just for that kind of analysis. And if you want to support further, right, Lieutenant and Colonel tier folks get access to weekly Q&As. That's actually both videos are dropping today. So, all right, let's talk. The link is in the description, of course. So let's take a look. Denmark is sending unarmed soldiers to Ukraine for drone warfare training. Now, there's something kind of insane about sending soldiers into a war zone so that they can learn how to fly drones, right? Generally, things kind of work in the other direction, right? Where Ukrainian troops go to Denmark for training and are trained by Danish troops. But obviously, the Ukrainians are the world experts on drone warfare, and countries, particularly like Denmark, have to make some pretty tough calls about what they see as their NATO partners, right? Namely, the United States' willingness to stand up and fight. So you can see Denmark out here, not necessarily in imminent danger of Russian aggressive action, but it's worth noting that NATO members currently include Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, all of which are considerable Danish allies, and Russian naval vessels operate very frequently in these oh my gosh, it's not the North Sea, in these kind of bays and areas. So the Danes definitely want to be prepared and understand the nature of warfare as it is. Again, I think it's pretty, I don't know, I think it's pretty messed up, honestly. I said we're sending teams to see what experiences the Ukrainians have had firsthand. They're not going there to participate in the war, right? What's funny is that one of the Ukrainian generals, or Danish generals, has said, quote, "In 42 years I've been in the armed forces, I've not experienced things moving as fast as they are right now." Talking about advances in unmanned systems and combat tactics driven by Ukraine's experience in drone warfare. And this is the problem this is one of the toughest parts about being in a military. And this is one of the reasons why it has to be taken seriously, right? And is that you have to you have to be prepared to fight today's war, right? You have to have the tools to defeat your enemies today, because that is what stops them, right? If the Russians woke up and really thought that there was a scenario in which they could beat all other militaries, all other competing militaries handily, right? At minimal cost, they would do it, right? The fact is they can't. The cost would be too high, so they don't. And so you have to have a military that can deter your adversary at the present, but also has to have a military that is constantly transforming into the war of the future. And the problem is that nobody really knows what that looks like. But sometimes, right, in an actual conflict like this Ukraine-Russia conflict, you see that we get to look into the future of warfare, or rather the future of warfare quickly becomes the present. And the Danes are smart to send their people to learn what today's war looks like, to understand what today's Russian military is, right? So they can be prepared to fight that. The problem is that the best way to fight a war is to fight a future war is to fight today's war, right? There's that and to go to Ukraine that is in the midst of a conflict, draw resources to do these kind of observation missions is not great. The Danes could do better. Again, I think there's a real need, even though, one of the things that's happened is that NATO has said, hey, we're going to train your troops. But oftentimes NATO training, particularly large scale like brigade operations, they teach them outdated NATO tactics that have nothing to do with the real battlefield. And so the best thing that the Danes could do to help the Ukrainians would actually be to say, listen, you send us some soldiers and we're going to train them not in highly advanced battlefield tactics. We are going to train them in the basics. We're going to give them rifle training, medical training, communications training, and maybe we'll even train them on some of your drones. And then we'll send them back to you and you can do the final integration, the final 2 weeks of training where they learn the nitty gritty of being a member of the Ukrainian armed forces. So again, I think that's a better policy, but I think it's smart of the Danes to finally get their head out of the sand and realize that it might not, the Danish military strategy of supporting NATO and having the United States be the thing that deters Russia. I think it's smart of them to say, no, we have to be prepared to deter and defeat Russia on our own. Now, there's another story that I think is really important, and that is this guy, Ed Martin, right? Now, the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia is a position that is where the attorney, right, the prosecutor, they is a person who not just prosecutes crimes, but decides which crimes get prosecuted at the federal level, right? If you get charged with a federal crime and you're in the D.C. area, it's going to be this guy, Ed Martin, the U.S. Attorney for D.C., who's going to make those decisions, right? And now, again, if you break into a car and steal somebody's iPhone, you're probably not going to face federal charges, right? But if you're running a drug racketeering operation in the Southeast, well, you may face federal charges. But more importantly, if you are a federal employee who, let's say, sells information to China, you're going to be charged, assuming you work in Washington, D.C., you're going to be charged by the D.C. Attorney's Office. And so given that, it is very troubling that Ed Martin has been repeatedly on the payroll of RT and Sputnik. These are not Russian-friendly media outlets. These are Russian state propaganda. The Russian government, the Kremlin, funds these almost entirely, right? And he was a commentator brought on to this dozens and dozens of times for nearly 10 years, okay? He also, right, advocated for the Stop the Steal movement, claiming that the 2020 election was rigged against Trump. He vowed to pursue legal action against anyone who has a problem with Elon Musk's Doge work, and is just generally combative with anyone who says anything mean about Donald Trump. Now, what's also noted is that he also went on Russian state TV, for example, in 2017, when Syrian dictator and Russian ally Bashar al-Assad staged a chemical attack against Syrian civilians, a huge human rights and war crime, a human rights violation and war crime. Martin went on RT and said that actually that incident may have been engineered by DC, by people that want war in Syria. Does this sound like the kind of disposition of someone who is who you want making these decisions about who to charge federal employees with something? This is pretty troubling. And again, this is someone has said in early 2022, Martin said in another appearance, he said there's no evidence of a Russian military buildup on Ukraine's borders. Remember, that was just 7 days before Russia launched a war against Ukraine. So he's willing to lie on behalf of Russia. And this is like pretty scary stuff, right? And if you have to have me convince you that this is a bad thing, I don't know what to tell you, right? He worked for a foreign hostile power. Imagine if you found out that I spent a decade as a America expert on Chinese state media, right? Would you trust me? Would you trust anything I said? No, you wouldn't. You would be wise to not do so, right? And So why then should you trust this guy to decide whether federal employees, American employees, are acting or behaving in ways that are complying with the law, right? This is someone who has said, I want to use the law as a weapon, right? And remember, he didn't disclose these appearances to Congress because it would have disrupted his appointment. But once he was appointed, all of a sudden, then the media said, oh, actually, we found this guy, right? And this is just completely preposterous, right? Now, I want to point out this is the official White House stance. They said President Trump made a brilliant choice in selecting Ed Martin to serve a full permanent term as U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia. With a distinguished record of service, Ed is the perfect leader to restore law and order and make our nation's capital safe and beautiful once again. Truly, truly some brilliant stuff. Anyway, guys, hit that subscribe button. I appreciate you guys as always. Thanks to James Sterling, Steve Marin, Doug Beck, Allen, Nuts and Bastian, Himling, Brian Kelly, Dale McCombs, James Alwa, and Henry Roussier, as well as all of our Lieutenant tier members. I couldn't do it without you guys. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.